Defendant Yutaro Yamada, 25, killed his grandfather, mother, and older brother, leading to his arrest and indictment. In the end, on January 15, 2025, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Yutaro Yamada. From childhood through junior high, he endured constant abuse from his older brother and lived in daily fear. Among all of that, the most humiliating experience was what his brother called the daily reflection meeting. If he didn't get his brother's approval after a bath, he would be urinated on. In the worst cases, he was even forced to drink it. At night, he was sometimes called into his brother's room and subjected to sexual violence. On top of that, he suffered daily violence not only from his brother, but also from his father. He was repeatedly forced to witness violence against both himself and his mother. In such a daily life, his heart was eaten away day by day. On the other hand, his grandparents doted on him, giving him pocket money and taking him to museums. That was how he stayed sane. However, after his grandparents got into financial trouble with his parents, the situation changed drastically. His once kind grandmother began to frequently ask him to beat his mother in exchange for money. In this way, even though Yutaro Yamada grew up in an abnormal home environment, he still made an effort to act cheerful and energetic outside. His efforts paid off, and he became a police officer. However, it seems that his past had become a trauma for him. When crimes related to abuse were discussed in police academy classes, memories of the abuse he suffered as a child resurfaced, and he began to suffer from severe headaches and nausea. Even after graduating from the academy and being assigned to the station, those symptoms persisted. Less than a year after his assignment, he was forced to resign. After that, he decided to return to his family home, but once he did, he began to experience even more intense flashbacks. And from this point on, two alternate personalities, Ryo-kun and Boy, began to appear within him. Ryo-kun takes on the memories of the abuse he suffered during his childhood. Boy is a violent and dominant presence. And this personality called Boy is the main personality. He could take over Yutaro Yamada's consciousness, and out of fear of not knowing what Boy would do, Yutaro tried to avoid contact with his family as much as possible by living a reverse day and night schedule. However, sometimes he would suddenly find his room in a mess, or realize he had just blinked. Or so he thought, until he found himself elsewhere or saw things prepared he didn't remember. Sometimes he would find hammers or alcohol loaded in the trunk of his car. That's right. If things keep going like this, something bad will happen someday. He needs to confront his own past in order to break out of this situation. He decides to hold a family meeting after reaching this conclusion. At that family meeting, he shares the pain he experienced with his father and older brother. He makes them aware of it and decides that the best course of action is to have them receive proper punishment from the police. He made that decision after much thought. And then, on March 7, 2022, the day before the incident, at the family meeting his parents, he and his twin brother attended, 4 people in total. They tried to start the family meeting, but he suddenly felt chest pain and was struck by a strong headache and flashbacks. The intensity of his past memories made him break down in tears. They chose to pause the discussion. They decided to hold the family meeting again the next day, when the eldest brother would arrive. And then, on March 8th, the day of the incident, as planned, the eldest brother, Kento, joined them, and all 5 family members gathered. Finally, with great determination, he was able to express his feelings to his father and his eldest brother. The 2 of them promised in front of everyone that they would go to the police. Because of that, he went back to his room to call the police. But Yutaro Yamada's memory ends there. The next time he regained consciousness, he was standing on the road in front of the house. When he hurried back inside, he heard his father's scream and saw that his father was holding a hammer in his hand. He ran and hid in the living room on the 2nd floor of his house. And then his father came after him to the living room on the 2nd floor. At that moment, his memory was cut off again. When he next regained consciousness, they were living together. His grandfather, mother, and his oldest brother, Kento, were lying there bleeding. After that, the three of them were immediately taken to the hospital, but all of them were pronounced dead there. On March 9th, after questioning, the Shizuoka Prefectural Police arrested 22-year-old Yutaro Yamada on suspicion of killing his grandfather and soon arrested him. A hammer, which was likely used as the weapon, was found at the scene. The autopsy results showed that all three died from head injuries. It was determined that the cause of death was traumatic injury, and the police confirmed the deaths. The investigation assumes the same suspect was involved in the other two deaths. After that, the suspect was rearrested on suspicion of murdering his grandmother, and then rearrested again on suspicion of murdering his eldest brother. However, about a week later, during police questioning, Yamada became involved in the case. He said he didn't remember what happened and was dissociated. He was found to have gender identity disorder and would undergo psychiatric evaluation. And then, on October 31, 2024, the first trial of Yamada. The defendant answered that he had no awareness or memory of killing someone. He completely denies the charges. In fact, during the questioning, Yamada, the defendant, claimed via an alternate personality named Boy that his father killed the three people. He was told not to worry, and because of that, he believed he hadn't killed anyone. However, in response, the prosecution stated in their opening remarks that the defendant was told by his grandparents that they would give him money if he would use violence against his mother. They argued that it was out of deep-seated resentment and anger that he committed the crime. The defense claimed there were no witnesses and suggested another real perpetrator could exist. Additionally, the defendant claimed he couldn't control his actions, saying a separate personality called Boy was responsible. In other words, they argued that he was either insane or mentally incompetent at the time of the crime, and pleaded for acquittal or a reduced sentence. This trial has two main points of contention. First, whether or not Yamada was actually the perpetrator, and second, if he was the perpetrator. The question is whether he can be held criminally responsible. Yamada's involvement in the case. At the time, multiple personalities different from his own appeared. There was no dispute between the prosecution and the defense regarding the fact that he was suffering from dissociative identity disorder. And, although there were differences in their opinions, the prosecution also acknowledged his condition. And during the defendant's interrogation, the extremely harsh and tragic upbringing of Yamada, which I mentioned at the beginning, was revealed. He endured abnormal abuse and was raised in a harsh family environment. As a result, he developed dissociative identity disorder. At a family meeting he held to try to change and overcome himself, an incident was caused by another personality. Why did this happen? Can you really say that with certainty? Actually, the other personality, Boy, was interrogated while that personality was present, and here is what he said at that time. The prosecution, the defense, the prosecution's case, the prosecution's crime, the prosecution's case, the defense's case, the person involved in the prosecution's case, the perpetrator at the time of the prosecution, and defense cases. I think killing is wrong, but killing the three demons is an exception. What we learn from Boy's statement, that means Boy is admitting to committing the crime. Also, the tape on the hammer, thought to be strange, matches the defendant Yamada's DNA. Taking into account that blood was detected, among other things, the prosecution believes Yamada. The prosecution claims it's unreasonable to think anyone but the defendant committed the crime, making Yamada's guilt certain. The trial's main issue is whether an uncontrollable alternate personality committed the crime. The focus is on how this should be interpreted. Yamada's psychiatric evaluation was conducted twice, but in fact, the opinions differed between the first and second evaluations. The first psychiatric evaluation concluded that this case was associated with dissociative identity disorder. The crime was carried out by an alternate personality, not the defendant's main personality. The second psychiatric evaluation concluded that the crime was committed while the defendant was consumed by strong emotions such as resentment and despair, and that the act was based on those memories and thoughts. Naturally, the prosecution adopted the opinion of the second psychiatric evaluation and regarded the first evaluation as unscientific and as a science fiction-like or occult view. They dismissed it, and furthermore, even if the defendant was in a state of defense, he was still aware of his own actions. It is clear that he was able to judge whether his actions were good or bad, and to control his behavior according to that judgment. Therefore, it cannot be said at all that he lacked these abilities, as suggested by the first evaluation. When considering sentencing, the loss of 3 lives is a serious consequence. He listed that the consequences are extremely serious, that the crime was necessary and brutal, based on a planned and strong intent to kill, such as preparing a weapon. Regarding the motive for the crime, he indicated that there are certain circumstances that should be taken into account in favor of the defendant. No matter how bad the environment or experiences, murder is never justified. He ruled that there is no room for justification and demanded life imprisonment for Yamada. The defense also insists on a not guilty verdict in response. Then, on January 15, 2025, during the latter half of the verdict, Judge Saibancho stated to Yamada that although the crime was committed by a different personality and his ability to control his actions was diminished, there was continuity before and after the crime. The judge recognized the defendant's full criminal responsibility and sentenced him to 30 years in prison. Attention is now focused on whether this case will be appealed. Then, on January 30, the defendant's side appealed the verdict. There's one thing about this verdict that I just can't get over. That's even though it acknowledges the existence of a separate personality and admits that the ability to control its actions was diminished. It's the fact that the defendant was still found to have full criminal responsibility. As I looked deeper, I found that people have spent years researching whether those with dissociative identity disorder can be held criminally responsible. I came across a professor. Professor Jun Uehara teaches at the Faculty of Law at Kagoshima University. And among Professor Jun Uehara's many papers, I found one titled, "A Study on the Criminal Responsibility of Patients with Dissociative Identity Disorder." It is written like this: it is regarded as a single unified whole. If you take that standpoint, ordinary consciousness is what lasts the longest. It refers to the main personality that controls actions, while the subpersonality takes control of the body when the flow of ordinary consciousness is interrupted. It can be understood as a consciousness with different content. In that case, due to dissociative identity disorder, the main personality itself is lost in the first place. It should be understood that way. And as a conclusion, what the subpersonality did. Regarding the act, the person with dissociative identity disorder who committed the act should be considered not responsible. And the paper's author is, I was able to contact Professor Jun Uehara directly by phone and asked for his opinion on this case. Professor Jun Uehara's opinion is, of course, just his personal view, but regarding this case, he expressed the opinion that there is no criminal responsibility. At the very least, he said that mental and physical confusion should have been recognized. After receiving such an opinion and ending the call, there were many parts I could understand, but I was left with a lingering feeling of discomfort in my heart. Even so, that doesn't mean it should result in a not guilty verdict or a reduced sentence. Even if he rejoined society, another personality could commit another crime. I felt that possibility wasn't being taken into consideration. I think it's extremely difficult to consider all the circumstances and the fear of the trial, but how did all of you feel about it? That's all for today. Thanks for watching until the end.